Well, welcome, everybody. My name is David Fleschler. I'm the Associate Provost for International Affairs here at the university. We're very honored to have the U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, Thomas Shannon, here today. But before introducing the ambassador, I'd like to say a few both thank yous and make a couple of introductions of some guests who are here. The thank you is to the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. The Council, many of you may know what they do, is one of our oldest international institutions in Cleveland, and they really have invited the ambassador to be here today and offered to partner with us to allow the ambassador to be here this afternoon. There's a program this evening for those of you who are interested in not only learning about education in Brazil, but the general U.S.-Brazil relationship. It's at the Union Club, and it's at 6 o'clock, and I'm sure those who are here from the Council would welcome everybody's participation. I'd like to introduce a couple of our guests as well. We're joined by not just one ambassador today, but we're joined by a second ambassador, Ambassador Hodges. You might want to stand and let people see who you are. Ambassador Heather Hodges is a Cleveland native with 31 years of experience in the Foreign Service. She was the U.S. ambassador to both Moldova from 2003 to 2006, and the U.S. ambassador to Ecuador from 2008 to 2011. I was going to go into a particularly colorful story that she could tell, but it's not her day to tell the colorful story. But Ambassador, we need to have you back to talk about that. What I know is a very interesting story, and we'll leave it to you to think about what that may be as we move forward. Our second guest is Eric Olson. Mr. Olson is with the Foreign Commercial Service of the Department of Commerce. He actually worked with Ambassador Hodges in Quito in Ecuador, and he will soon be opening a new U.S. commercial office at the U.S. consulate in Recife in Brazil. So we have two foreign service personnel with us today. And I'd also like to introduce Maura O'Donnell McCarthy, who's the Executive Director of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and will be one of our hosts this evening. So today we're honored to be joined by Ambassador Thomas Shannon, Jr. Ambassador Shannon has spent his career representing the U.S. in the Senior Foreign Service. He served in such interesting and exotic, I would say, locations as Venezuela, South Africa, Cameroon, Gabon, and I actually looked this up in Wikipedia today because I didn't know it, Sao Tome and Principe, and Guatemala. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Special Assistant to the President, and Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. He was the U.S. Deputy Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States. He holds a B.A. from William & Mary and a doctorate and master's from Oxford University. Since 2009, Ambassador Shannon has been the U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, which we all know is one of the rising economies and countries in the world. As I think, again, we all know, Brazil is set to host both the World Cup and the Olympics, the Summer Olympics in the next round. And so the world will get to know Brazil in a much more granular way than it has up until now. Ambassador Shannon has a truly unique seat, not only to watch, but also to influence both the growth and maturity of this great country. Ambassador Shannon, one of the missions at our university is to promote an inclusive culture of global citizenship. And as part of advancing that mission, our students are looking forward to your insight today, not only about Brazil, but about how our students can interact with students, faculty, and universities in Brazil, really in order to help produce global citizens, both here and in Brazil. After he talks, I think that you're open to taking a few questions from our students and faculty and staff. Case Western Reserve University, I'm honored to introduce U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, Thomas Shannon.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I've already been fed lunch here, so I'm very happy to be at Case Western Reserve University, and it was a good lunch. And thank you very much, and I'm happy to have a chance to talk to all of you. Actually, the quicker we can get to questions and answers, the better it's going to be for me, because in many ways, I'm going to learn as much from this talk as you are, because hearing your comments and hearing your questions, I'm going to understand better the kinds of challenges we have in front of us as we try to use education as a centerpiece in the U.S.-Brazil relationship, a relationship that I believe is going to be one of the defining relationships of the 21st century. And I thought what I would do, just to kind of set the context, is first talk a little bit about Brazil and why it's important to the United States, without giving away too much for tonight's talk. Secondly, talk about what we're doing on the education side and why it matters in the relationship, but then use that to talk a little bit about what diplomacy is going to be like in the 21st century and why something like education is going to be so central to what we're trying to do. You know, I've been in Brazil, as was noted, a little over 3 years now, but it's my second time in Brazil. I served there from 1989 to 1992 in my third tour in the Foreign Service. I've been doing this for about 29 years. And so I've spent 6 out of 29 years in Brazil, but at very different moments in my career and very different moments in Brazil's history. And as I compare and contrast what's happened in Brazil over that period of time, I'm really struck because the Brazil of today, when compared to the Brazil of 25 years ago, is the same in terms of its language and its boundaries, but that's about it. In every other way, Brazil has transformed itself in remarkable fashion. It's consolidated its democracy, it's created institutions that function, it has built representative structures which, although they face the challenges that all parties and representative structures face throughout the world, does a pretty good job of channeling interests and purposes of the larger population. It has built a civil society which is active and vocal and plays a role in decision making. It has built a stable economy that has a positive growth path over time and has been able to produce a significant amount of economic wealth. And through its social policies, it has been able to use that economic wealth to address very deeply ingrained social inequities like poverty, inequality, and social exclusion. And in the process, it has built off of a very attractive popular culture, whether it be in sports or music or dance or literature, and really attracted the world to it in a unique way. And as we consider the Brazil of the 21st century, we consider a country which today is the 7th largest economy in the world, but has every possibility of becoming the 4th largest economy in the world by the middle of the century. And we consider a country which is going to be central to all of the major multilateral or transnational issues that we are going to be facing over the next several decades, whether it be food security, energy security, management of water, stewardship of the environment, or the fight against trafficking in drugs, weapons, and people. Brazil is going to be a central partner to us in all of these areas. And so as we try to understand where the U.S.-Brazil relationship is going, we take a step back and kind of look what the past was, which was a relationship that was essentially friendly, but not particularly close. Admiring, but we're both a little too busy for each other. Because we're the largest economies in the Western Hemisphere, we're the largest land masses in the Western Hemisphere as far as countries are concerned. And although we are the largest democracies, multi-ethnic and multiracial democracies in the hemisphere, we have both spent so much time focusing on ourselves and developing ourselves and pursuing our own interests, ourselves in North America and beyond, in Brazil and South America, that while the relationship sometimes produced moments of great collaboration, like during World War II when we were allies and fought together in Italy. It has also brought with it periods which were really fallow periods in which both countries were busy taking care of business elsewhere and really didn't have time for each other. But as Brazil has emerged in the world in a significant way, we are bumping into Brazil in a variety of different places in ways that we didn't imagine. We're bumping into Brazil in the Middle East, we're bumping into Brazil in China, we're bumping into Brazil in Africa. And as we do so, we're having to rethink what our relationship with Brazil is and what it means. And Brazil is having to rethink its relationship with us and reimagine its relationship with us and understand how both countries can work together in pursuit of interests that oftentimes converge but sometimes don't. And as we reimagine this relationship, what's becoming increasingly apparent is that, first of all, the constancy or the quantity of our contact and communication and engagement has increased dramatically. And in turn, we have tried to increase the quality of our contact and our engagement to make sure that we have the high-level engagement that we need to direct our governments, but that also we're bringing together our experts so that when we talk about any issue, whether it be energy issues or food security issues or the fight against non-proliferation or the fight to prevent the proliferation of weapons, that we have our experts talking to each other and that we're engaging in ways in which we're actually sharing information that's meaningful to each other. But as we get deeper into this process, what's becoming increasingly apparent to both of us is that the real driver in the relationship is no longer governments, it's societies. And a principal driver in this relationship is how our universities relate to each other and how our educational communities relate to each other. And the reason this is important is because Brazil has shown clearly over time that when it commits itself to broad-term strategic goals, when it puts the financing behind those goals, and when it uses education as a means to achieve those goals, it's successful. It has proven this in its pro-alcohol program, which created its biofuels and biodiesel industry. It has shown this in the creation of Embrapa, which is its agricultural research service, and has allowed Brazil to produce an agricultural miracle, where Brazil moved from being a food importer to being a food exporter. And today, Brazil is the second largest food exporter in the world after the United States. It has shown this in the area of aerospace and the civil aviation industry, in which, through its relationship with the United States and American universities, was able to create its own aerospace engineering capability and produce an Embraer, one of the most important civil aviation companies in the world. In fact, today, when I flew from Washington to Cleveland, I flew on an Embraer 145. Excellent aircraft, got me here safely. Very happy with that. And there are, today we're moving in our relationship, we're even moving beyond the industrial nature of innovation into social innovation. And we're seeing that Brazil, through programs like Bolsa Familia or Minha Casa, Minha Vida, has been able to address issues of poverty and inequality in a really significant way and in a very short period of time. So as we began to think about what the next steps in our relationship would be, we determined that we needed to focus on education. We needed to find a way to connect our universities, to connect our students, and to build a fluidity in our educational relationship that would allow Americans to experience Brazil in a unique and important way, and Brazilians to study the United States in a unique and important way. And in conversations between President Obama and President Rousseff, one thing we worked out was, on the Brazilian side, Science Without Borders, which is a program that many of you are familiar with. In fact, some of you might be recipients of Science Without Borders scholarships. And then on the U.S. side, 100,000 strong in the Americas, where we look for ways to place American students in Brazil to study in Brazilian universities. And when President Obama and President Rousseff met in Brasilia in 2011 and had a chance to talk about this program, both programs were in infancy. President Rousseff had determined that she needed to find a way to jumpstart the high end of her economy. She needed to find a way that she could take science and engineering and technical expertise and inject it into the economy in a way that Brazil would start producing at a much more significant pace a value-added product like aircraft that would make Brazil more than just a provider of economy, provider of commodities and services. And as she struggled with this, she was fashioning a program with her Minister of Science and Technology and her Minister of Education that would begin to identify universities in the United States that would accept students and would begin a process of identifying Brazilian students and funding those students. But in her conversations with President Obama noted that he had just come from Asia and that he had made a commitment to put 100,000 American students into Asia to match the great number of Asian students who were studying in the United States. And with that impetus, President Rousseff determined that Brazil could do one better. It would do 101,000 students, and it would send 101,000 students overseas, not just to the United States, but to other centers of excellence in the area of science, technology, engineering, and math, whether it be Germany, France, the UK, Canada, Australia, or beyond. And she constructed a program that many of you are familiar with, in which the government agreed to fund 75,000 students over a period of time, and the Brazilian private sector agreed to fund 26,000 students over a period of time. And we have begun this process, and over the last year and a half, working with the key Brazilian institutions that are managing both the selection of students and the identifying of funding, and American institutions that place Brazilian students in the United States, a means in which we have placed over the last year and a half roughly 5,000 to 6,000 students here in Brazil. The United States at this point in time is the #1 recipient of Brazilian students, followed very closely by Portugal. It's significant. Portugal has just emerged as a player in Science Without Borders, largely for language reasons. But we believe that over time, we can capture the majority of Brazilian students, anywhere from 50 to 60,000 of the students, if we're able to create the right kinds of structures. And this is why my visit here to Case Western Reserve is so interesting and so important for us. Because as we have gotten into this process, and as we have worked with our partners, and we have excellent partners here in the United States, in IIE and in LASPOW and other entities that help us place both undergraduate and graduate students, we realize that that we are pushing a lot of students through a very small aperture, and that in order to reach the kinds of numbers that we want, we're going to have to start to expand that aperture and build out and try to find ways that we can establish relationships between universities, between Brazilian universities and American universities, that will allow larger numbers of students to flow back and forth between our two sets of universities. And the advantage that Brazil and the United States have in this kind of relationship is that we have lots of universities. This is especially true for the United States. For the Brazilian students who are currently participating in Science Without Borders, they're scattered through over 200 universities and colleges in 48 different states, which is pretty remarkable. But it's been useful for us because we've been able to meet a Brazilian demand. And even though we don't have a centralized system that accepts students, we have so many universities that we can accept a lot of students. Brazil also has a significant number of universities, not nearly as many as we do, but their federal university system is the strong system. They also have several pontifical universities or Catholic universities that are first rate. And we're going to be able to manage the flow of students between the two countries, I think, in a pretty rational and reasonable way. But as we get deeper into this process and we realize the interest that exists in Brazilian students studying in the United States and the developing interest in American students studying in Brazil, is that we are on the verge of, I think, a very interesting scientific and technological relationship, where if we do this right, we're not only going to create pathways for students to move back and forth between our two countries, but we're going to create pathways for faculty and researchers to move back and forth between our two countries. And we're going to be able to connect our laboratories in interesting and useful ways. And as we do this, it's going to have a profound impact on South America. Chile already has a smaller version of Science Without Borders called the Chile-California relationship, where Chile sends students to the University of California system. But it's relatively small in terms of numbers. But if you look at countries like Argentina, Uruguay, Colombia, Chile, There is a base there in the universities and a base there in the interest in science and technology and the base there in an interest in using science and technology to affect economic development, that we're going to be able to expand this program beyond Brazil into a larger hemispheric program that I believe is going to allow the United States, really for the first time, to play a fundamental role in changing how the rest of the hemisphere understands development and play a fundamental role in building within a larger Western Hemisphere a science and technology capacity that is going to be hugely useful to the United States. Useful because it's in an area that is broadly defined by shared political values, which is democracy, broadly defined by a shared economic understanding, which is market economy, and broadly understood by a shared understanding of what an individual is, what the state is, and how the two should interact with each other. And in the process of doing this, we have the potential of creating shared research purposes, laboratories, and researchers and universities that will operate within effectively a broad sphere of peace and prosperity and will be protected over time from the ravages that we're going to see elsewhere in the world. Because the reality is the United States faces very serious security challenges around the world. Whether in the Korean Peninsula, whether in Iran or the larger Middle East and North Africa, or in South Asia, as we understand better the relationship between Pakistan and India, and as we try to deal with the emergence of China as a significant partner and competitor at the same time. And so as we think about this world, it would be nice if we could wall off our hemisphere, create a hemisphere not only of shared political and economic understandings and purposes, but also an area in which we can use our capacity in science and technology and engineering and math and beyond to create a degree of commonality of research, a degree of commonality of research purposes, so that we can begin to unlock what we call the content of democracy, which is about ensuring that our democratic states and governments can provide to our citizens not only a political space and a voice in determining national destiny, but also the means and the capacity necessary to have a voice in determining individual destiny. And in this regard, Brazil and the United States share similar commitments. And as we try to take this very young program and make it a success, we are going to depend on universities like this university to make this real, because we can't do it by ourselves. And this brings me to really my larger and final point, which is the nature of diplomacy in the 21st century. It is increasingly apparent to me, and I've been doing this for 29 years, that governments are going to be less and less controllers and definers of relationships between states and more facilitators. Excuse me. And what I mean by that is there was a period of time in which the U.S.-Brazil relationship was defined by what our government said about the relationship. In other words, what the U.S. government said or what the Brazilian government said about a relationship, and that what our peoples had to say was largely irrelevant. But because of the nature of how our two societies have connected, whether it be in terms of commerce and investment, whether it be in terms of education, whether it be in terms of the relationships between faith-based institutions and churches, or how our NGOs and civil societies relate to each other, and also in terms of tourism, we're seeing societies that are increasingly making demands of government about the relationship, whether it is to facilitate the movement of tourists, whether it is to facilitate the movement of students, or whether it's to find ways to open greater space for trade and common investment. And what this means is that governments are having to respond to the very specific demands of our citizens. And this is only going to grow over time. And what this means is that our diplomacy is going to become socially based, and it's going to have to respond to very specific needs of our citizens. And obviously, the most immediate is addressing problems like poverty, like inequality, like social exclusion, also dealing with issues like citizen security. But as we get deeper into this century, we're going to see that where the synergies and the importance of the relationship lie will be in areas like health and education, and ensuring that people have the means and needs, the means necessary and the capacity necessary to achieve what they want to achieve in life. And so as we understand what the nature of the U.S.-Brazil relationship is going to be, and as we look at avenues to push that relationship in directions that are going to be broadly helpful to the United States, we understand and recognize that education is going to be one of the most important and interesting areas, and that the university education and programs like Science Without Borders are going to be some of the programs that have the most immediate impact. Obviously, both of our societies and countries have deeper issues, whether they be in the infrastructure area, human resource area, or issues related to energy and innovation and security. And some of them are deep-rooted, and some of them are going to require a lot of thought, effort, money, and time. But there are certain areas where, in a fairly short period of time, we can have a big impact with a reasonable amount of money, and do it in a way that benefits both of our societies and connects both of our societies. And so in that regard, it's a tremendous pleasure to be here at Case Western Reserve University. It's a tremendous pleasure to be hosted by the university and have a chance to speak to the deans of the different schools and examine how we can cooperate and work together to ensure a smoother flow of students and faculty. But it's especially a pleasure for me to have a chance to speak to members of the student body here. And I hope that in the comments and questions that come from this, I will be able to understand better your own experiences, your interests, your needs in this regard, and how we at the embassy in Brazil, in Brasilia, and how the U.S. government can be responsive to all of you. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for having me here today, and I'm happy to take your comments and questions. Who's going to start? How many Brazilians do we have in the crowd? Parabéns. Muito obrigado. How has your experience been here? Yes, ma'am. Como?
Uma portuguesa.
Oh, uma portuguesa. Ah, parabéns. Excellent. Sir.
Is it important for our students to be proficient in Portuguese to go down here?
It is. It is. In fact, this is one of the challenges we face as we look at ways to put U.S. students into Brazilian universities, is to get Portuguese language at the right level. And just talking about my experience in the Department of State, I entered the Department of State in 1984 when the Central American wars were in full swing in El Salvador and Nicaragua and beyond. And at that point in time, there were still a lot of Portuguese speakers in the Department of State, largely because Brazil at one point in time had a large U.S. government presence. USAID and Peace Corps and our military had a considerable presence in Brazil. And so there was a personnel need to develop lots of Portuguese speakers. As we worked through the crises in Central America and then the crises in the Andes that consumed so much of our diplomatic efforts in the Americas during the 80s and 90s, many of these Portuguese speakers retired. And they weren't replaced because so much of our focus was on Spanish-speaking South America. And so when I became Assistant Secretary of State during the Bush administration, I could count the number of Portuguese speakers in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs on both hands. But that is changing in a significant way because there's such an enormous demand for visas in Brazil right now from Brazilians who are traveling to the United States, either for education or for tourism. We have had to dramatically expand the number of consular officers who address issues who work directly with the Brazilian public. And so we have expanded by several hundred the number of Portuguese speakers we have in our mission right now, which is recreating a core group of Brazilianists and Portuguese speakers that are going to be very helpful to the Department of State in the years to come. And one of my missions as I go around to universities is, number one, to convince universities that don't have Portuguese language programs to start them. But secondly, to convince students who are interested in Latin America to study Portuguese, because Brazil is not going away. It's only going to be more important over time. This is especially true if it is able to become the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. And what that means for U.S. interests, and especially for the interests of students who would like a career in international affairs, whether it be in government or in business or in education or in the not-for-profit sector, is going to be huge, because we're going to see the relationship between Brazil and the United States becoming so fluid and constant that expertise in Brazil in English and expertise in the United States in Portuguese is going to become crucial. That was a long answer to a short question. But
I'm very familiar with the Science Without Borders program, and I know what the structure of that is. But actually, I'm not really familiar with a program in the United States for sending 100,000 students to Brazil. Could you describe what that program is?
Yeah, it was announced by the president following his stop in Brazil. He did a 3-stop tour of Latin America. He did Brazil, Chile, and El Salvador. And when he was in Chile, he announced the 100 Strong in the Americas program. The reason you haven't heard as much about it is that it's not fully funded the way the Brazilian program is. And in fact, we have been working with largely the private sector to begin to identify the funding necessary to begin to have more scholarships and send more students down into the region, but also trying to build off the presence of American students that already exist or that are already present in Mexico, Central America, and South America. Because we find that these students are the ones that can oftentimes pull more students into the region. And also what we're finding is, especially for students who are interested in junior year abroad, that the old junior year abroad standards, the UK, Italy, and Spain, are still of interest to students, but students are becoming more adventuresome. They're going to China, they're going to Brazil and elsewhere. And so we are working through the Department of State, and especially through the Education and Culture Agency of the Department of State, to promote the broader 100,000 strong program. But it still doesn't have the profile that Science Without Borders does.
The Science Without Borders program itself, as I understand it, technically ends in 2014 or 2015. And clearly there haven't been 101,000 students that have gone out. Do you expect that that the program will be extended, either in terms of the time that the program will be existing, or in terms of numbers?
Yeah, I think the key figure in Science Without Borders is 101,000, as opposed to any finite year end. In other words, they're going to push out 101,000 students. That's what they budgeted for. That's what they've gotten their commitments for from the private sector. And this was the initiative of President Rousseff. In many ways, it's going to be one of her signature initiatives. It's something she's going to use to show that she dramatically and fundamentally changed how the Brazilian economy functions through Science Without Borders. And she fully expects to be reelected in 2014, which would extend her mandate beyond to 2018. But I think that Science Without Borders will meet the number of students they want to send overseas. But in the process of doing that, it's going to unlock, I think, a variety of other possibilities for exchanges. And maybe beyond the science, technology, and engineering and math area, but beyond the STEM area to areas of the social sciences. But also we're seeing already a tremendous interest in the Brazilian side in building relationships between community colleges. Brazil doesn't really have community colleges, but it has kind of vocational training centers that have programs that are similar to the programs we see in some of our community colleges. And so we're going to see, I think, a much more interesting relationship in that regard. But as we talked about earlier, as Brazil looks ahead and tries to determine how it builds its economy, it's evident that it doesn't have enough people right now to do everything that needs to get done. And by not having enough people, I'm not just talking about scientists and management specialists. I'm also talking about trained craftsmen and tradesmen and artisans, whether it's welders, electricians, plumbers. They don't have enough. On the health side, they don't have enough nurses. They don't have enough people who can work with anesthesia, who can help in surgery, and so they have to to address some of these issues by bringing people from the outside in, but they also need to address them through training programs. And I think the potential there is huge.
Is there more of a focus in these programs on undergraduate studies or as opposed to graduate studies, or
right now, the focus has been largely on undergraduate, but that's changing. The Brazilians are very keen on having a strong graduate component to this, both master's and doctoral programs. But they have started with undergraduates in what they call sandwich scholarships. In other words, 1 year in the United States between several in Brazil. And they've done this, first of all, because it's easier to manage and easier to start. Secondly, they know that the students are going to come back and finish their career programs in Brazil. And it's a way of testing the relationships with the universities and understand and getting a better feel for which universities are helping the Brazilian students to succeed and where they need to begin focusing. Because this right now, if you were looking at a map, it would really cover all of the continental United States. I mean, it's impressive. You know, there's like Brazilians everywhere right now. It's amazing. But as they get deeper into this, they're going to be a lot more focused on the doctoral and master's degree program, because that, in many ways, is where they move beyond this being just an experience, an academic experience for the student, but actually becomes something that shapes their research future or their employment future.
What are the plans to evaluate or measure the success of the Science Without Borders program in terms of justifying these types of programs continuing upon being employed?
You know, that's a really good question, because this is a significant outlay of money. Just say on the U.S. side, say we're able to get half, a little more than half, say 60,000 students out of the 101,000. I mean, you figure out how much it costs to send a student to a university like this with tuition and room and board and travel and all the incidental expenses. But just to pick a number out of the air, say it's $50,000. That's $3 billion. That's a significant program. I mean, if this were an assistance program or a commercial program, it would have everybody's attention. And the idea that U.S. universities could reap that kind of reward to receive Brazilian students is one of the reasons why it's so attractive. But the Brazilians anticipate that the payback in Brazil is going to be many times higher than that, especially as Brazilians begin to capture their academic experiences here and their business experiences. Because remember, the Science Without Borders program connects not just an academic year, but also a period of internship, either in laboratories or with American companies. And so the student returns to Brazil with not just an academic experience, but a much broader experience. And the idea is that this is going to have an impact inside the universities where they are returning to, but especially as these young men and women emerge, graduate, and then take jobs, they are really going to be the next generation of leadership in science and technology and entrepreneurism. And in that regard, the Brazilians fully expect that this is going to pay back in a very significant way. However, in the short term, it's going to be very hard to measure what that payback is. And so I think the first indicators they're going to use is how many students are successful. In other words, how many students complete their year? The ones who are, say, undergraduates, how many actually complete the year and come back with a kind of energized and intent on using their experiences to shape the remaining years of education in Brazil. On the graduate and doctoral side, it's going to take longer because those programs are longer. But in that regard, they're really going to measure by the kinds of research relationships they build and what issues they're working on and how those progress over time. But in some ways, this is a program which is only going to be measured accurately a decade or so out. Sure. Anyway, thank you all very much. I really appreciate this.
So, Ambassador, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward, at Case Western Reserve, we look forward to working closely both with the embassy, the government in Brazil, and a variety of universities in building our relationship up and forward to meet many of the many of the ideals that you talked about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.